Hi everyone, Dr. Bruce here. In this video, I'm going to cover some nervous system anatomy using the 3D models I've developed. I will put a link to the models in your announcement. Let's begin with this particular model, the brain and the spinal cord. So let's just go full screen on this and let's take a look at this. So the nervous system, as you know, is divided into two main parts, the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. The central nervous system consists of the brain and spinal cord. The peripheral nervous system, of course, are all the nerves that come out from the brain and spinal cord, and you can categorize that into three parts. Those would be the cranial nerves, the spinal nerves, and the autonomic nervous system. That would be the peripheral nervous system. But here we see primarily the central nervous system. So the brain consists of the outer part called the cerebrum, and then there's the cerebellum. There's also the brainstem, and then there is the spinal cord. The spinal cord begins at the foramen magnum and ends at about the second lumbar vertebrae L2, and you can see the nerves coming out of all of these things. Let's take a little bit of a closer look at the brain. So I'm going to switch over to a different model. Let's use this one. This model shows just the surface of the brain called the cerebrum. When you look at the surface of the cerebrum, you see that it's covered in folds and then there are grooves. The folds are called gyri and the grooves are called sulci. The deep grooves are called fissures. So we have some important landmarks here. For one, the first lobe here is called the frontal lobe. That's this one. And if you click on these annotations, it'll tell you. So we have the frontal lobe, and then behind that is the parietal lobe, and then behind that is the occipital lobe. And then below the parietal and frontal lobes is the temporal lobe. And then, of course, we have the cerebellum here and the brainstem. Now, what about these grooves? So this one, number 7 here, this is called the central sulcus, and this divides the frontal lobe from parietal lobe. There's also a lateral sulcus here as well that separates out the temporal lobe. So the functions of the frontal lobe. The frontal lobe pretty much processes, like the higher cognitive functions like personality, problem solving, concentration, planning, a little bit of language, and also motor skills, like motor information. So if you voluntarily move a muscle, that's coming from the frontal lobe, specifically the precentral gyrus. The parietal lobe is the sensory lobe, so it's going to process sensation, touch, pressure, pain, and temperature. The temporal lobe primarily processes sound, so hearing, and then it also has other functions in memory and some other things. And the occipital lobe is primarily devoted to vision. So there we have the main lobes of the cerebrum. So let's use a different model now, and let's go a little deeper. Let's take a look at the sagittal section. So this is a mid-sagittal section of the brain, so you can see the outer cerebrum again, and then this is inside. So what we see here is we see this, what's called the white matter bridge that connects the two hemispheres. There are two sides of the brain called hemispheres are connected via this structure called the corpus callosum. This is white matter, and there's white matter and there's gray matter. White matter is actually contains a lipid substance called myelin and is actually faster than gray matter. So this is actually made out of myelin or contains myelin. There are some other structures below that, but one of the main structures I want you to know is this sort of oval structure called the thalamus. That's below the corpus callosum, and this entire area is called the diencephalon. So the thalamus is part of the diencephalon. The thalamus has an important function in that it relays sensory information to the cerebrum. So remember, the parietal lobe processes sensory information. That information, say, is going to come up the spinal cord, go through the brainstem, go to the thalamus, and then get routed over to the parietal lobe. Just in front of that, anterior and inferior to that, is a sort of flattened area called the hypothalamus. This is a very important structure as well. We're going to see the function of the hypothalamus a lot in the endocrine system because it secretes hormones and it monitors different things in the circulatory system, like concentration and things like that. So the hypothalamus will be connected to the pituitary gland, which we don't see. The pituitary gland is actually outside of the brain and sits, as you know, in the sella turcica of the sphenoid bone. You might remember that from the skeletal system. So below the thalamus, we have the brainstem, and there are three parts. The first part, superior part, is the midbrain. Then we have the pons, and then we have the medulla oblongata. So the brainstem, primarily the primary function of the brainstem is maintenance, like homeostasis. We see a lot of centers in the brainstem that control respiration, control the heart rate, and so on. So there are a lot of these control centers located in the brainstem, as well as the nuclei of some cranial nerves. Then we have the cerebellum. The cerebellum here, and you can see it, sort of rotate it and take a look at it. The cerebellum processes information related to fine motor movements, coordination, balance, and proprioception. And proprioception is the joint position in space. So you know that your arm is bent because of proprioception. Okay, I think that's about it for this video. I don't want this to get too long. Again, I'll put the link in the announcements. Feel free to contact me with any questions. I'm happy to help in any way I can, and we'll see you next time.